What's cooking, everybody? Dave Altizer here with Kinotika, and today we're comparing the video quality of the EOS R with the Sony a7III. We are so excited that we finally received the EOS R, and we wanted to make a video as quick as possible comparing some of the things that I know you guys are anxious to see. We got the 24-105 f4 IS lens bundled with this camera. We also got the adapter so that we could use older EF lenses, and we are going to be testing that. But this video is specifically about comparing the 4K and even the 1080p image quality of the EOS R with the a7III. We've been using the Sony a7III now for a couple of months as our primary production camera on Kinotika, and I'm curious to see if the EOS R is up for the task of potentially replacing the a7III. On paper, it doesn't look like it's possible to replace what we're getting right now on the a7III, but I've been surprised with Canon in the past with their image quality and color science. We're going to be making several videos on the EOS R in the coming weeks, so make sure to stay subscribed to see all those. Without further ado, let's get testing. In this first sequence, we tested the autofocus performance of both the Canon EOS R and the Sony a7III. Both cameras have really good autofocus for video, and as you can see, the face tracking was working really well on both of these shots. On the left is the Canon, on the right is the Sony. This is not a huge surprise because both of these cameras have great face tracking and phase detect autofocus, so it's pretty reliable. The Canon really needs to perform well in 1080p because it's the only mode you can shoot full frame video on and 60 frames per second. So as you can see here, the Canon is looking, it's okay, it's a little soft. The Sony, however, is a much sharper image, but once you zoom in to 400%, you'll actually see the moire going on the window there. But when you put it next to the Canon, you're getting way more moire and aliasing going on in the image. Side by side, you can clearly see that the Sony is much sharper than the Canon and has less image issues. As soon as you switch over to the 4K mode on the EOS R, it crops in on the sensor, which is normally a full frame sensor, giving us a 1x crop, if you will, to 1.75x roughly. And some people are saying it's even 1.8 technically because it's an Ultra HD, not Cinema 4K. So this shot here is with the Canon at 24mm, and earlier it looked like this. This is 24mm on the Sony. You can see how much of a crop is going on there. To solve for that crop, obviously you need to use different lenses to get the focal lengths that you desire. So I put the Canon 10 to 18mm STM lens on, and it gave me a nice wide angle. All those image issues that we saw with the 1080p are completely gone. The Sony is definitely a little bit sharper than the Canon, but it's nothing that you can't fix in post with maybe a little bit of sharpening. I actually really like the look of the 4K on the Canon. It's a little bit more cinematic and less digital. Next is a rolling shutter performance test. As you can see in 1080p on the Sony, it looks pretty dang good. Same for the Canon, it's not that bad. Crop in on the Sony gets even better, virtually none. But crop in on the Canon in 1080p and you've got terrible rolling shutter. Once you switch to 4K on the Sony, however, we do have some rolling shutter performance, not that bad. And look at that Canon, man, that wobbly jello. When you put the Sony 4K next to the Canon, you can see that the Canon is substantially worse. Next is slow motion performance. Both the Sony and the Canon can do 1080p at 60 frames per second with autofocus tracking. The Canon and the Sony both look as good as their 1080p footage that we looked at earlier, so that's nice to see. The Sony does look a little bit sharper than the Canon for sure. But once we go to 120 frames per second, that's when things really change a lot. We're getting 720p on the Canon and 1080p on the Sony. Also, autofocus tracking with the Sony and no autofocus whatsoever on the Canon, only manual focusing. So you're really not going to want to use that very much at all. Next is log. Canon log is a well-known log format. It's been around since the C300, and we have it now on the EOS R, which is a welcome addition. I just shot this in S-Log 2 because I consider that the best log on the Sony. Did a quick grade, and as you can see, they're both kind of okay. The Sony's not looking too hot. Canon log, no grade. Canon log with a grade, and as you can see, this is why people love Canon. I mean, we're shooting 4K here, great colors, great just richness overall. Instead of shooting S-Log, I decided to switch to the EOS HD Pro Color that I've also modified a little bit to be slightly flatter. This is a flat version of Pro Color, which I found grades really well. It's clearly not as flat as Canon Log is, but once I color grade this, I find that the saturation, color, and richness is very similar to Canon. And as you can see, when you put these two side by side, they're not that different. I mean, obviously people are gonna light me up in the comments for saying that, because of course the Canon does look better, without a doubt. The Canon has a much more natural look to it and richness, but the Sony is looking really good these days, and it's not as bad as it used to be. I really think the color science is slightly less of an issue than it used to be in the past, because Sony has done a really good job of dialing it in, and once you use a good profile like one from Andrew Reed, you can really get pleasing results, and I'm definitely not disappointed with the Sony anymore like I was with the previous A7S model, for example. Next is a stabilization test. The Sony has IBIS in camera and the Canon doesn't, but it does have lens IS. So we're using the stabilization from the lens on the Canon here, and I just wanted to hand hold it and see if it was possible on both the Sony and the Canon. They kind of look similar, to be honest. There might be a little bit less shake on the Sony with that IBIS, but the stabilization handheld is definitely not bad. I was using the EVF on the Canon EOS R, and that's kind of a good workaround to stabilize your footage better. So here we are.
What's up?
We're vlogging on the EOS R in 4K. It's
that lens works well.
This lens is the perfect focal length. I'm using the 10-18, which is super cheap. It's like 250 bucks.
What about like walking and rolling shutter and all that?
Let's test rolling shutter. Shall we go?
Yeah, you go, I'll stay. Bye.
Okay. I've got this thing on a GorillaPod style setup. I don't know, is this too shaky? This lens does have IS. This camera unfortunately does not have IBIS, but it does have something that most cameras don't have in 4K, and that is a flip out screen. So I can actually see myself when I'm vlogging, which is the best way to vlog, as anybody who does this for a living would say. I'm gonna take a picture of my setup here so you can see exactly what I'm rocking. So we're vlogging now on the a7III in 4K. We do have face tracking, which is great, but I don't know what I'm filming. I also don't know if I'm rolling because there's no monitor on here. I'm not using a monitor. If I were using a monitor, I would lose face tracking, which is something that's essential when you're vlogging. One benefit though is you do get full frame 4K versus the EOS R, which has a ridiculous 1.7x crop. This camera also has IBIS, which paired with the lens that I'm using here, the 16-35 Zeiss, gives you a bunch of stabilization because the lens itself has stabilization and the body. The rolling shutter is much better on this camera. Let's see how the stabilization looks. I'm just gonna walk. Again, I have no idea what this looks like because I can't see my screen. However, two of the biggest vloggers in the world, Peter McKinnon and Casey Neistat, use cameras that don't have flip out screens, the 1DX Mark II. So it is certainly not something that you have to have. I don't know. How's it look? I can't tell because there's no screen. So is the EOS R a good video camera? Yes and no. There are some positives for sure with the autofocus, with the flip out selfie screen. A lot of the usability of this camera is really great. I didn't mention this, but there is a little ring here that you can customize and have it declicked for video purposes if you send it into Canon, which gives you a clickless aperture control, which is kind of neat for video as well. There's a lot of little things that are pretty good about this camera, but compared to the a7III, it's really lackluster in a lot of things. Other than the flip out selfie screen, the a7III basically beats this camera in all areas. You have 4K in both full frame and crop mode. The rolling shutter performance in 4K is much better than this in 4K. I mean, the rolling shutter on this was terrible. The color is getting so much better with the Sonys. I think it's almost not really an issue anymore to compare the color science. And I don't know. I think it really just comes down to the flip out screen and the autofocus. If you really need a flip out screen, if you're a vlogger and you make a living on YouTube and you only shoot by yourself, I think this is a better option, especially for 1080p shooters. And if you use a cropped lens like this 10-18 millimeter, you can get away with 4K. It's just kind of a shame that it's not full frame. It's a 1.75x crop in the 4K mode. And like I said, you get the rolling shutter problems. Also, let's not forget, this camera costs more money than the a7 III, and the a7 III has so many great video features. You also have the ability to plug in XLR adapters on the a7 III. The battery life is twice as good. You can charge it while you're using it. You can't actually charge the battery while you're using this camera. We still have to do some more testing, and we really want to see if this camera can fit into our workflow. I think the autofocus and the flip out screen alone are two things that are really worth having with this camera. If you enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up, and if you want to see more of the EOS R content, make sure that you're subscribed below and enable notifications. We are moving to California next week, so we're really excited about that. We're going to be putting out videos as we transition there. It's going to be a lot of fun. Maybe our next review will be on the beach. Once again, I'm Dave Altizer. This is Canon's first full-frame mirrorless camera. See you next time.